All right, Emily, what's on your radar?
Well, one of the biggest lies in politics is that conservatives are, quote, waging a culture war. Just this week, Governor Ron DeSantis was accused in the Associated Press of, quote, plunging his state into a culture war battle by signing a bill on transgenderism and women's sports. This is not merely a matter of semantics, and it's not just red meat for a drooling right-wing base. It's the equivalent of one kid punching another kid on the playground and then the second kid getting blamed for picking a fight. Why is that important? For the sake of honesty, yes, but also for the sake of cooling cultural tensions. Let's consider one recent case study that illustrates this well. The folks over at Blue's Clues, which is a property of Viacom's CBS, wrote a pride parade into the show recently. The musical segment featured words like non-binary, ace, bi, and pan, along with literally a cartoon representation of a beaver with top scars. I'm not making that up. Snopes actually fact-checked it. BuzzFeed said the segment, quote, might be the best thing Nickelodeon has ever made. But why should anyone, let alone populists, give a damn about a pride segment on Blue's Clues? Well, for starters, it clarifies the framing. Cultural progressives in media and politics own their goals when it's convenient, taking credit for creating big changes. But then they blame conservatives for starting a culture war when it isn't as convenient. The literal definition of the term progressive says it all, and that's okay. Change the culture if you think it needs to be changed. Don't, however, expect defenders of the current order to just be bulldozed. That's actually not even a healthy way for progress anyway. This is really the key point. Ron DeSantis didn't, quote, plunge his state into a culture war by restricting student athletes to competing with their biological sex. The left plunged Florida into a culture war by pushing for changes to the current definition of biological sex. And again, that's okay. Own it. But don't then blame conservatives for picking culture war fights when it's your own goal to wage war on the culture. That's just not what's happening. But in the service of Democrats who wish to deflect from their own role in bogging the country down in culture war battles, the media goes along with this framing, and the prevailing narrative is that the right is obsessed with the culture wars. The right is almost always on defense in the culture war. As a Christian conservative, I think many of these battles are worth mounting a defense on. Some of them aren't, and of course, absolutely, Republicans can be deeply cynical and exploitive when it comes to making red meat out of culture clashes for fundraising and for campaigning. Like a whole lot of people on the left, they care less about the substance and more about milking our divisions to enhance their own power. Now, let's return to Blue's Clues for a moment. Check out this tweet from someone identified as a Wellesley College student. It reads, "Why did Blue's Clues acknowledge my identity's existence before Wellesley College Health Services?" with a screenshot of the ace, bi, and pan line from that video on Blue's Clues. That's actually a profound reflection, and it's well worth considering whether you like the Blue's Clues segment or not. Because educated elites sort into the halls of power, they moved fairly radical ideas from our classrooms to our writers' rooms and newsrooms and boardrooms really quickly. The momentum is built so quickly that Blue's Clues is now outpacing Wellesley. The effect is that the rest of the country is being asked to adapt very quickly, lest they face charges of bigotry and potential consequences. Remember what happened when 60 Minutes ran a painfully balanced segment on detransitioners last month. Major, well-funded special interest groups lashed out. People can care about LGBT rights, but prefer to discuss, let's say, pansexuality with young kids on their own terms. It's absurd for the left at Blue's Clues and BuzzFeed to toss a charged, jargon-heavy segment like that out into society and then blame people for reacting. If you insist on throwing it out there and you actually care about cooling cultural tensions, we'll all be much better off if the message is communicated in a way that actually mitigates the inevitable clash. But the left actually loves the culture war. And that is not red meat hyperbole meant to distract from the plight of America's working class. America's working class is actually affected by this problem more than anyone because you can't afford to step out of line when you live paycheck to paycheck, and elites use identity politics to shield their power by disempowering critics. They cloak themselves in empty progressive signaling and hope people look the other way. Remember when the Human Rights Campaign named Raytheon a best place to work? Now, if your sincere belief is that equality necessarily entails full and immediate cultural acceptance of progressive conceptions of sex and gender, that's totally fine with me. I disagree, but I'm more than happy to hear you out. The point is that the left tries to shift blame for inflaming cultural tensions onto the center and onto the right when they react to demands for swift and dramatic change. Furthermore, when corporatists jump onto the bandwagon, they're doing that to make money, distract from questionable labor practices, and bulldoze existing norms despite some disagreement from people with less power. It's time to stop letting powerful Democrats and progressives deflect from their own role in heightening our cultural tensions. All right, Ryan, this is obviously a really charged topic, but I do think it's a very important point to make. It's very frustrating when the right gets blamed for picking a culture war and for starting a culture war. And it's absolutely true that a lot of times people on the right jump onto this and do behave like they're dangling red meat in front of the base. There's no question about that. But at the same time, I really think progressives, especially cultural progressives, should just own the fact that they're trying to make swift and dramatic changes to the culture instead of deflecting it onto the right to sort of distance themselves from what they're doing.
Right, and there are also so many different people and you're on different places in the spectrum who are arguing different points throughout this that it's hard to paint with one brush. But it's interesting to try to figure out where this comes from, and it's impossible to really trace it all the way back because you probably go back to the beginning of time. But I do want to give you one kind of left view of how this really started.
Please. And
get your response to it as someone who's kind of like a true believer in this in your position here. So there's a book that I did a podcast episode on it, Deconstructed, called "The Lie That Binds," written by Elise Hogue, and she tells the history of kind of how the right moved into this particular culture war politics. And her story goes roughly like this, that in the 1950s, 1960s, you've got the New Deal kind of hegemonic. And you start to have real success from the civil rights movement. And you start to see desegregation taking hold in school systems, 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. And from 54, for the next decade and a half or so, the right is really pushing back hard against desegregation. They lose that public fight. Now, they've actually kind of resegregated schools since then, but they lose that fight publicly. And so then in the 1970s, they can no longer galvanize kind of a white working class base around the issue of segregation. And so there's this famous conference call that she talks about. And you've probably heard of this one. Paul Weyrich, I think, was leading it. And he's like, what issue can we move to next? And the polling at the time found that even among evangelical Christians, abortion rights were polling at over 50%. And somebody on the conference call, it's lost to history, who was like, what if we do abortion? And everybody's like, abortion. That's not bad.
Right.
Let's try that. We're talking about the life of the unborn. It's not anti-woman. It's not misogynistic. We're talking about the children, and we're talking about the future of civilization. But it can then be channeled into the kind of idea of you're supporting a patriarchy. Without saying that that's what you're supporting, and you can kind of then whip up this base. And I think Donald Trump kind of instinctually just adopted that view. Like if you look throughout his presidency, whenever he was in trouble, he'd be like, give the abortion people something. Yeah. Because they were his most undying and unquestionably loyal base to him. And nobody believes that Donald Trump, I don't even think the evangelical movement believes that Donald Trump in his heart is some type of foe of abortion. But he saw it as politically advantageous to have that base of support behind him. The people that Weyrich aligned this movement with, was the Chamber of Commerce, trying to get back into power and to try to overthrow this New Deal hegemony. So that would be kind of one argument for who and how this started.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, it would be impossible to deny that there's been some strategery on the part of the right when it comes to, I think, still responding in the culture war, because what's interesting about that call, and I do think I do actually think the conservative movement had attached itself to the abortion issue before that call. And so I think that sort of confuses the narrative a little bit, because I think Catholic conservatives in particular had been on top of this earlier than that. But what is interesting, when you dig down into that, it's still them figuring out how to respond to something that is a movement on the left that is seeking to change the laws and seeking to change our cultural norms when it comes to life and when it comes to abortion. And again, my point really is, as you say, I am a true believer. I'm a Christian conservative, so obviously I come down on certain sides of these issues. But I think it's just important for the left to acknowledge that they want to fight the culture war, that at the end of the day, they love the culture war. And it's strange to me that this always gets deflected to the right. It's like elites sort of feel like it makes them, it's like getting their hands dirty to fight these cultural battles. But then they love to champion, they love to say, listen, we're a best place to work. We're Raytheon, and we're sort of celebrated now. So when it's convenient, they own it. When it's not, it's like dirty and gross, and that's what the toothless rubes are interested in. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think we're all better off if we admit that these cultural issues are important, and the left should admit it. The left should admit they're trying to make big changes to the culture. It's in the name progressive, and I don't think it's just a matter of semantics. I guess that's really the point at the end of the day that I'm getting at.
No, for sure, and absolutely, there are elements of the culture war that are I think unquestionably good. The civil rights movement,
Yes.
Advances for LGBT community, for women. Right now, when it comes for women, when it comes to Raytheon, celebrating itself for it, whatever woke thing it's celebrating itself for at the moment, then no, then what you're seeing is what happens with all legitimate movements, that as soon as they begin to pressure power in a serious way, power finds a way to co-opt that language. That doesn't mean that the original movement was wrong, but it means be careful what you're hearing from Raytheon and other people who absolutely do not have anybody's best interests at mind except the executives at Raytheon.
Yes, absolutely. And their bottom lines and their bank accounts. No, I agree with that completely. I guess to me, it's just, it's the important point, I guess, at the end of the day to me is just that, we have to acknowledge where some of this tension is coming from. And it's not just coming from Donald Trump. It's not just coming from the right. And I think to the extent that the left keeps that in mind as, they're writing segments like the Blue's Clues segment, which might seem like a really stupid and silly thing to talk about. And I completely understand that. But at the end of the day, I actually think there are a lot of people in this country, and they're not just Republicans or conservatives, who are going to watch something like that and be like, really? 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 And then maybe they'll watch something like this and be like, really? We're talking about Blue's Clues. But at the end of the day, it's an important point, I think, to at least pause and say, if you're going to throw something like that out into the universe, you should probably expect people are going to respond to it. And it's not really fair to deflect it onto them for starting this fight in the first place. So that said, we'll hear what's on Ryan's radar when Rising returns next. I'm guessing it's not Blue's Clues.
No, not Blue's Clues.
We'll be right back.